Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Cap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to Season 4, Episode 37 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 10 and the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I think it's Week 10.
It is Week 10.
It is Week 10. All right, so Week 10 coming up. The weeks are just flying by, and I am your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Cap. Nick, I had a terrible football weekend. It was miserable. So I am moving on from Week 9 and everything that came with it. It was miserable, and I'm moving on.
We can't move on yet because we do need to recap the week. But after today, you can move on. I hope everybody that's watching, today's an election day, so hopefully we could be your escape from whatever craziness goes on today. We're gonna, that's our goal. We're gonna have a fun show. Yeah, talk some football because that's the most important thing.
It's actually trade deadline day. We will talk
too.
Fantasy trades, but it is NFL trade deadline day, so that is what I will personally be focused on.
That is the juicy news on the day.
That is the juicy news. So, this is the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. If you're a first-time listener or viewer, thank you so much. Maybe you tapped into our live show for Week 9. Hopefully, we helped you out. If we told you to play JoeFlaco, we do apologize. We used our best knowledge, and that was a miss on our part. But we did have a couple other we had a couple other good takes from that show. I told everybody that I could to play Gesicki on the Bengals, and I played him. I made a spot start about an hour before kickoff, and he helped me in Nick's league that I probably lost it unless Kareem Hunt had 30 points on Monday Night Football. But that's thanks to a multitude of injuries on my team. But anyway, if you're a first-time viewer or watcher, thank you so much for joining the show. We give you guys 2 shows during the week on Tuesdays and Fridays, available on our YouTube and audio streaming platforms. And then you can follow us and interact with us on all social media platforms. We're everywhere. Anywhere you find us, we're everywhere. This is our Tuesday show. We give you 3 segments on our Tuesday show. We kick things off with a waiver wire segment. It does get shorter and shorter as the weeks go on, as the waiver wire does get smaller and smaller, but we still do have a waiver wire segment. Then we're going to give you our top 5 takeaways from a fantasy football perspective from that week. So Nick will have 5, I'll have 5. They will be different. Then we're going to end the show with a quick trade segment, 1 player to trade for, 1 player to trade away, and me and Nick will each give you one of those players for each. We'll keep that segment going probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks until trade deadline. So that's what we got on deck for this show. And like I said, we're kicking things off with the waiver wires. This is waiver wire week 10. I'll preface this by saying for the second week in a row, there are no running backs available that we think are worth picking up in a majority of competitive leagues. Yeah. Starting things off with the quarterback position. Justin Herbert is owned in 43.3% of leagues, and the percentages, like I do say every week, but again, if you're a first-time listener, I do like to make things transparent. These percentages are based off ESPN. We did have to pick a platform before the season, and this is what we decided to use. So again, Justin Herbert is owned in 43.3% of ESPN leagues, Tua Tagovailoa 42%, and then Matthew Stafford at 29.8%. So Nick, who would you go and attack this week if you needed a spot start, if you needed a quarterback? Dak Prescott's going to be out for a couple weeks. Who would you go and attack if you needed to attack a quarterback?
So if you need it for 1 week, I want Tua. I want him in LA. I want him in a warm environment. That receiving core, that offense is starting to get a little bit more rolling. They're not winning games, but they did just score 27 on Buffalo, a team that they've historically struggled with. And the week before, I believe they were at 27 or 28. So with Tua, that offense is looking a lot better. I definitely want a share of him. I think he's a little undervalued right now. Same thing goes with Herbert. I mentioned it this past week when I had Ladd McConkey on the All Boom team. But for the first 4 weeks of the season, Justin Herbert was only throwing 22.5 times per game. That is very, very low for a quarterback. That is now up to about 30 per game. So they are up. They made a conscious effort since the bye week to up the passing volume for Justin Herbert, and he's looked pretty good. You guys will know better than we do today if any trades happen, but there are rumors that the Chargers are trying to get a receiver. If they are able to bring Mike Williams back, a guy that he has a good connection with, who's a deep threat, opens up the field a little bit more. I don't think Mike Williams is going to be fantasy relevant, but I think Justin Herbert needs someone else over the top to be consistent. and it opens up the playbook. We've seen Herbert be a stat sheet stuffer before, and I think that seeing the increased volume and the schedule is not too difficult on the back half of the year, he's going to be a very solid starter for some weeks.
I like Matthew Stafford a lot. He finally has his offense fully healthy back-to-back weeks. He has 18 plus fantasy points with his offense fully healthy. Nick had the Rams as a top 5 offense from a fantasy football perspective heading into the season. So I think that offense will start to get rolling, and the Rams do have a chance to contend for a wild card spot in the NFC. Next year, again, like I said, no running backs. They're just, it's too scarce. There's really nobody else to pick up unless you want to pick up a potential handcuff. But then you're not hoping for an injury, but you're picking them up in case of an injury. So moving on to receivers, Cedric Tillman, who Nick told you to pick up 2 weeks ago on our deep dive segment on that Friday show, is still only owned in 47.8% of ESPN leagues. He is probably owned in all your competitive leagues, but if he's available, go pick him up. Then we have Xavier Legette owned at 32.7% of ESPN leagues. Bryce Young looked much improved after getting benched. That was promising. Jalen Tolbert owned in 22% of leagues. He did have a touchdown with Cooper Rush late in the game. Cooper Rush will be starting for the Cowboys, I think, for the rest of the season. Dak's out a couple weeks, but I don't think Dak's going to return. That's my personal opinion. And then we have Quentin Johnston, who's only owned in 21% of leagues. He had, I think, 16, 17 fantasy points. He's had a couple really big games with Herbert this season, and if Herbert's going to start to throw more, Johnston has learned how to catch a football and does seem to have a connection with Herbert. So that is promising, especially if you have him in a dynasty league like I do. So Nick, I think all these guys definitely should be rostered. I think I would personally rank them Tillman, Johnston, Legette, and Tolbert, but I think they could all definitely be rostered.
I have the same exact order. Not going to give too much analysis based on that, but I will say, obviously, Cedric Tillman needs to be rostered based off his last 3 weeks. Quentin Johnston's been very sneaky consistent the last few weeks. He doesn't get a ton of workload, but he keeps getting these deep catches and these touchdowns that are racking up his season for a solid fantasy season. Xavier Legette has a touchdown.
I just want to jump in. Before his injury, too, he was pretty solid. Then he was out, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. But his first 4 weeks, I think he had 2 or 3 like double-digit performances. So it's not just a recent uptick for Quentin Johnston this season. It just kind of derailed due to the fact that they don't throw a lot and due to the injury.
And then Xavier Legette, he did get a little banged up this week, but I'm pretty sure he has a touchdown in 4 of his last 6 games for a rookie.
I think he does, yeah.
And a big receiver, very good. And then Jalen Tolbert, CD's a little banged up, might miss this week. We'll find out later on in the week. But Jalen Tolbert will definitely be a spot start. This team has a good game script for him. My one concern would be if they do decide to go with Trey Lance, and that might be a fun football decision. It'll keep the Cowboys relevant because we know Jerry Jones loves being must-see TV, and Trey Lance will definitely be something people want to tune into. But Trey Lance is not a very accurate quarterback, so if we do get the news that Trey Lance is going to be the guy that they want to roll with, which I think makes a lot of sense, you invest the draft capital into him. You can start him. You can't start him for fantasy, but you could start him if he's good. You could either trade him. You could move off Dak if he actually turns out to be really good, and if he's really bad, you get a better draft pick. So to me, Trey Lance makes a lot of sense for the Dallas Cowboys to move with. But if that's the case, I don't like any of the fantasy options, frankly, moving forward.
And then for tight end, Hunter Henry, who we said for a couple weeks to pick up, he's tight end 6 on the season, owned in 40.6% of leagues. Taysom Hill, who we said last week to pick up and play, he scored a touchdown, 26.6% of leagues. And then Mike Gesicki's owned in 10.8% of leagues. I personally only want Gesicki if T. Higgins is out. I think he becomes the second or third receiving option for Burrow. But if Higgins is in, then I really don't have an interest in Gesicki. But that's my take. My take is that Hunter Henry probably needs to be owned in all leagues at this point, especially with the position being so thin and fluid.
Yeah, I agree. If I know that T. Higgins is out, I want Mike Gesicki. He's been super good in the games that Higgins has been out. He's stepped up in 3 of those spots, which is great. And then Hunter Henry, I don't think he should be I think he should be rostered in your competitive leagues at this point, but clearly Drake May likes throwing him the ball. He has looked really, really good in all of his games where Drake May
rookie quarterbacks target the tight ends. Both Zach Ertz and Hunter Henry have had very productive seasons.
And Cole Kmet's had some big games too. So maybe not Bo Nix. Bo Nix doesn't like the tight ends, but
they don't have a tight end. It doesn't count.
Exactly. They don't have.
They need Jake Butt. That's what they need. They need Jake Butt back.
The return of Jake Butt.
Yep.
And Noah Fant, Seahawks.
And Noah Fant. Yeah, we can trade him back. Yeah. And then we do have 2 defenses here. I will say it's a very competitive week of matchups. I think it was tough for me to find defenses that I think were possibly streamable and worth even picking up. But I picked here the Chargers at the Jaguars, and the Vikings at the Jaguars, and the Chargers hosting the Titans. But the rest of these matchups do look pretty competitive. Who do the Cowboys have though?
Cowboys host Philadelphia.
I did consider putting that one too. So maybe Philly, but there really isn't a ton of. I maybe Nick feels differently. I personally don't see like Ravens, Bengals. Giants, Panthers, I feel like that game could go one of two ways. Like it's really bad or really good. You're not going to stream the Chiefs because you either have the Chiefs or you don't. Steelers, Commanders, like I'm running through, Falcons, Saints. I would love to say the Falcons defense, but the Saints just fired Dennis Allen, and that's always a wonky week when you fire the head coach. I wouldn't want to play, the 49ers defense, if they're lurking out there, would be a good play against the Bucks possibly. But yeah, I'm looking at the list. Patriots, Bears, I think the Bears are bad, but I don't know. Anyway, so those are the two defenses that I personally picked out, but I think there's a lot of competitive matchups, and I think defense is going to be a tough stream this week.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do like Chicago if they are available. They didn't look good this past week, but they have looked good in pretty much every game this year outside of that
Good
one.
point,
Also, 6.5 point favorites, 39.5 over under on the week. So the implied point total is very, very low for the Patriots, which should make them a pretty safe option. Drake May, obviously, rookie quarterback showdown between these two teams. I like that option. Like Nick mentioned, I think a lot of people are going to jump at getting the Giants against Carolina. I don't want to touch that game in Germany. I don't like touching
it. Just screams wacky to me. Not just that it's a Germany game, but Bryce Young sort of kind of looked good, and I really do like the Giants front seven. So part of me wants to take that, but I don't know. It just screams wacky to me.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right, so we're going to move on now to our top 5 takeaways from week 10. Nick, what is your first takeaway, and do you have a theme?
I do have a theme because
Nick likes his themes.
I like my themes for these takeaways because I find myself saying, all right, we got something to work here. And I'll take my first 2 or 3 and I say, all right, these all make sense in the same thing. So my theme for the week is undervalued fantasy players. This is pretty much a list of 5 guys that I think this week showed me that I have been undervaluing them, or maybe I've been properly valuing them, but the fantasy community doesn't properly value them over the course of the season. And I'm going to start off with the guy that I have pounded the table on for the entire offseason, the entire show, and I still think he's underrated in Devon Achane after his huge week this week. So, Nick, I love giving you some trivia. I got 3 fun questions for you. Tua as quarterback, and we have not seen Monday Night Football yet. What is Devon Achane's worst finish this year?
In terms of what points?
Running back on the week.
His worst finish with Tua at quarterback. Are we including week 2 against the Bills?
Week 1, week 2, and then these past 2 weeks.
I'm going to say running back 7.
Running back 3. He has finished in the top 3 every single week with Tua. Nick, what is his least amount of points scored in a game with Tua this year?
It's got to be like 18.
23. And Nick, what is the least amount of targets that Devon Achane has gotten in a game with Tua?
5.
7. He is on pace for one of the craziest seasons with Tua were healthy of all time. He has 28 catches in those 4 games, 5 TDs in that time. Tua, if he were healthy, he would be averaging, if you assume those 4 games were the entire season, 27.8 points per game. He'd be on pace for 473 points in a year, which would be the second most points scored in fantasy football history, only behind LaDainian Tomlinson in 2006. It would outscore 2019 Christian McCaffrey's number.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm going to say he's underrated is because nobody recognizes that if Tua were healthy and he kept up the pace, he's literally on pace for an MVP season at the running back position. It is absolutely absurd, and no one talks about him in the way we talk about Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, Saquon. Devon Achane, if he keeps up this production, is the 101 in fantasy next year, and I don't really think it's debatable. I'm sure people will debate it, but if he stays healthy, puts up these numbers, there is no reason he should not. He's literally putting up better than Christian McCaffrey numbers in his prime. I mean, it's very hard to ignore those numbers.
Interesting. All right. So I was going with a theme, but then I broke my theme on my fifth take. But my theme is bad football and how it affects fantasy. So first take here, Joe Flacco. We were wrong about Joe Flacco, and we do like to pat ourselves on the back when we're right about things, especially when it comes to our Sunday morning shows. We were wrong about Joe Flacco, and we had a lot of good takes for Joe Flacco. He was good this year when he was a starter. When he was the Browns quarterback last year as a starter, I think his lowest total was 17 fantasy points. So the data told us that Flacco was a good play, especially against a Vikings defense that has surrendered a good chunk of points to receivers and quarterbacks. Well, we got a very bad game on Sunday Night Football that really wasn't fantasy friendly. So Flacco threw for 179 yards and 1 touchdown. He ended up being the quarterback 29. No wide receiver on the team had over 60 yards. Jonathan Taylor had a bad game. I don't even think they took a snap in the red zone the entire game. I guess the fantasy take being, I guess Flacco was not the savior of the Colts that we thought he could be. And some of these takes that I'm going to give you could also equate to a bad defensive matchup. And Brian Flores has got those boys moving in Minnesota, but I just thought Flacco would play better. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen with Anthony Richardson sitting on the sidelines. And a lot of people are giving the Colts flack for giving up on Richardson after only 7 or 8 career starts. So the Flacco era, I think, could possibly be done, with the Colts for now, which would be unfortunate because he is the best option for our fantasy teams, I think. But unfortunately on Sunday night, he totally dropped the ball on PrimeTime, which is not a good sign. Sure. So your second take.
So my next underrated player is Jacoby Myers. Nick and I talked about him on the Sunday show.
Yeah, I was probably wrong about that one. I can admit that. This is a good underrated player because I didn't realize his numbers before Sunday show.
So on the Sunday show, someone asked us a question about Myers, and we pulled up the numbers, and we were both like, "Oh my god!" Like the numbers speak volumes. And then he reinforced it this week. So his last 5 games, and you got to keep in mind, all of these were without Davante Adams because he was injured and then obviously traded from the team. 9, 10, 9, 11, and 7. His last 5 games points, these are rounded 21, 10, 13, 17, 18. And you might say, it's game script. It's taking advantage of bad matchups. He got shadowed by Patrick Surtain and Trent McDuffie. Those are 2 of the best cover corners in football. Now you take a look at his playoff schedule going up against the Atlanta Falcons, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the New Orleans Saints. All these teams are bottom 8 in points allowed to the wide receiver position. The game script we know is going to be good. And they also just fired their offensive coordinator. So they're going to have some change in play calling, which should benefit your wide receiver 1. It typically does. So hopefully this change is a good sign. He's going into the bye. I believe it's this week or next week, and that is the perfect time to go trade for him. It's the team. He's probably most often a guy like that's probably sitting on a team that's middle of the pack, someone that wants to make the playoff run, needs a win. Go ahead and get him because the consistency has been there, and that playoff schedule is very juicy for a wide receiver like that.
I got to talk about our man, Jabo. Listen, Jabo had a rough one. 235 yards, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. I actually told some people to play the Chargers defense this past weekend, knowing that they were guaranteed at least 1 Jameis pick. I said, you're immediately going to get a minus, +2.
It was built in.
+6 is +6. Finishes quarterback 19. And the bigger issue that I have is that you're going to get good in bed with Jameis, but your Browns, besides Tillman, really aren't lock and loaded like they could be. Neither running back was over 40 yards. Chubb still looks injured, and Ford is still in the mix. Tillman looked good again, 6 for 75 and 1. I think Judy had 7 or 8 targets, which is fine. But Elijah Moore and David Njoku were kind of not involved. And it's just, Jameis is not a quarterback. I wouldn't want to roster Jameis over the 3 quarterbacks we just talked about in our waiver wire segment. I would drop Jameis for any of those 3 quarterbacks going forward. And the only Brown that I think is only fantasy relevant on a week in and week out basis is Tillman. And I'm sure people are still going to have reservations about playing him. So although Jameis is an upgrade over Deshaun Watson, he is still Jameis Winston. And we love him for the good. We love him for the bad, but he is still Jameis Winston. He still is a wild card, no matter what team he's facing every single week.
We love him for the speeches too. You can't forget.
The speeches are great. The speeches are great.
Gotta feel motivated after
your third take. Who's your third underrated player?
I'm going with Rico Dowdle.
Nick loves Rico Dowdle. This is a Nick guy. It's becoming a Nick guy.
He's becoming a Nick guy. So over the last 4 games, 13.1, 19.4, 10.5, 21.7. Of that time, 2 of those finishes were in the top 10, and they came against tough defenses. He played the Detroit Lions, played the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's been pretty solid. The last 6 games, this was the number that really stood out to me. He's been a very efficient football player. He has over 4 yards per carry in each and every one of those games. So as much as we criticize the Cowboys running game, he is an effective runner in that metric, which is good to know. He doesn't have that breakaway speed of Tony Pollard that can really open up the game like they used to have, but he does have that safe floor and that efficiency. He also has 4 games this year with 5 targets, and this was the first week without Ezekiel Elliott. And no Zeke, he had 71% snap share, his highest of the year. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is more of a trend than a one-off, because Zeke is having a lot of off-the-field issues. It makes sense for them to cut ties with Zeke. I don't know if they'll do it because Jerry Jones loves Zeke, but he was willing to let him go once. He let him go to the New England Patriots, and then he wanted them back. Wouldn't be surprised if he lets him go. Now we take a look at the playoff schedule. Carolina Panthers, Tampa Bay, and Philly. Granted, Philly is a tougher matchup, but we're going to get a preview this week of what that looks like. So something to keep your eye on, and we'll see that. But to me, he is a definite guy that you need to have on your team. I did see a lot of waiver wire shows had him as a top ed, so I guess he might have been dropped from the bye week, or maybe he was injured I think he was injured for a week or something like that. But his numbers have been very, very solid. And for me, I definitely want a piece of Rico Gathers, and I don't think you need to trade much at all to go get him at this point, because nobody is taking that Cowboys team seriously.
So my Seahawks are bad, especially on the offensive line. Like they might have a bottom 3 line in the league. They led 7 sacks yesterday to the Rams. They had over 60% percentage when it comes to pressures allowed. The right side of the offensive line allowed 4 of those sacks and a pressure on, I believe, over 70% of plays. So the line is really bad. Geno finishes quarterback 3. JSN had an awesome game. However, I think this will affect the offense going forward, especially when it comes to Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker now has back-to-back games with his lowest finishes of the season. One was 13, which isn't bad. The other one was under 10. He only had 83 yards in this game, 3 receptions. And Walker is one of the leaders in touchdown percentage when he's in the game. So his touchdowns have actually been a saving grace. It's been tough for him to get going, even to get 1 effing yard on 2 plays yesterday because of how bad that offensive line is. And newsflash, the Rams don't have Aaron Donald anymore, or Von Miller, or Bobby Wagner. Like, they don't even have a big dog up front. I know they have Jared Verse and a couple others that they retooled, but they do not have the big dogs like they used to. But they still bully that Seahawks offensive line that has been terrible throughout the season and has been an issue throughout the season. So, if you're a Kenneth Walker owner, I think you have to be a little bit worried about the fact that the Seahawks have struggled to get the running game going because of how bad that offensive line has been. And it makes me very, very sad.
Sure.
Take number 4.
So the next guy I like and I think is very undervalued, and another guy that I didn't realize how good he was until someone on his team got injured this past week, was Chase Brown. His last 6 games, 23.2, 16.4, 14.4. He had a dud at 7.3. 11.4 in this past week, the biggest weekend game of his career, 26.7. The last 4 weeks, he has had above a 50% snap share. So it was trending away from Zach Moss and more towards Chase Brown. He has 3 finishes of these 6 weeks in the top 12. And this is an elite offense. Nick is talking about bad offenses that don't put up points, or where the offensive woes struggle and hurt the fantasy players. Well, we know the Cincinnati Bengals are going to put up fantasy points. They do the entire year outside of the first few weeks. And in those games where they're putting up points, he has 6 touchdowns in his last 6 games. That is very, very good value and something nobody's really talking about. Right now, he is the RB20 on the season. Here's some name guys in similar ranges that Nick and I both like. And Nick and I either have said trade away or trade for. And I know a lot of shows like all 3 of these guys. Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson. All of them are within 2 rankings up or down from Chase Brown. And Chase Brown is on the best offense of the 3 of them.
I think you're correct, and I think Chase Brown might be a league winner. Zach Moss looks like he could be out for a couple weeks. That might be Chase Brown's backfield. The last team I'm going to talk about that is bad is the Chicago Bears. Matt Eberflus is possibly the worst head coach in the league, and I cannot believe they didn't go in and get a better head coach this offseason to pair with Caleb Williams. But the Bears front office, they should actually clean house. Like, Poles should be gone, and so should Eberflus, and they're doing a disservice to the young players on this team. That defense is filled with studs. Caleb's a stud. The receivers and DJ Moore and Dunze, and they are doing a disservice to this team by running the fact that they are running both Matt Eberflus and Shane Waldron out there to call plays. So Caleb Williams against a bad Cardinals defense finishes the quarterback 26. The Bears as a team only had 240 total offensive yards. They only scored 9 touchdowns, no TDs. The only saving grace of this Bears offense over the past 4 weeks has been DeAndre Swift being consistent. 5 games at 14 plus fantasy points after me and Nick just totally cursed him. Yeah. And DJ Moore, who I told you last week to trade away, had yet another game under 8 fantasy points, and that's going to be a tough guy to trade away at this point. With 3 straight finishes under 10 fantasy points. So, yeah, the Bears are bad. They are still the same old Bears, and until they get the coaching right, and there will be other coaching candidates out there this offseason, they're still going to be the Bears, and that's just the reality of it. I mean, you look at the Commanders, they went and got the correct coaching staff. I don't love Dan Quinn as a head coach, but they got Dan Quinn, who is a head coach that has gotten to a Super Bowl. And what I really love for Jaden Daniels is that they went out and got Cliff Kingsbury to be the OC. And I've said it before on this show, said it to friends. Some coaches are meant to be OCs or DCs. I think Dan Quinn is actually meant to just be a DC, but get another head coaching gig. But I just think that some head coach, like with the Chiefs, Spags, he's a DC. That's just the reality of it. I'm a USC fan and not thrilled with Lincoln Riley. I don't think he's a good head coach, but I think he's a great OC. Same with Cliff, great OC. Matt Patricia, I think he could be a DC. Like there's people that should be DCs and or OCs and just not head coaches. And if you know your role, you should have a job in the league for the rest of your life because you'll be good at your job. Yeah. And the Bears don't have anything right now when it comes to coaching. So no. Your fifth takeaway, who's your 5th underrated player?
So it's Cedric Tillman. I mean, I am very
Nick's
proud.
all over this one. And this is one of Nick's better takes of the year for sure.
For sure, it's trending that way, and he's the wide receiver 1 over the last 3 weeks. And before this week, he was a wide receiver 1 over the prior 2 weeks. So this is now 3 weeks, which is a third of the season because it's been 9 weeks through of him being fantastic. He's averaging 22.2 points per game in that span. He has 32 targets over the last 3 weeks. He has 3 touchdowns, and the production has been great. Now they're going into the bye. I know we have concerns about Jameis, but Jameis's interceptions are a good thing for Cedric Tillman. It means they got to pass more at the end of the game. And that's why you see him. He got a touchdown here. He got a touchdown last week on the last drive. And you might say, well, is that sustainable for fantasy? Doesn't matter. Points on drives count for fantasy football. And he is absolutely trending towards a waiver wire winner. After the bye, Jameis gets to play the Denver Broncos. And the Denver Broncos and Sean Payton are a revenge game for Jameis Winston. Because if you remember, he never wanted to hand the keys to Jameis. He wanted to hand them to Taysom Hill. So I think Jabu is coming for that team, and I think he's coming for some revenge.
Okay, so my 5th takeaway is a positive takeaway, and I want to speak about Terry McLaurin, who's been excellent. Since week 3, Terry McLaurin is your wide receiver 3. He has 13-plus fantasy points in all 7 games that he's played since week 3. 4 of those games, he has 17-plus fantasy points. And then I want to pull up his schedule because I do like his schedule down the stretch here. So the Commanders, they do have a tough one here with the Steelers. Then after that, it gets a bit easier. The Eagles is an easy secondary. Cowboys, an easy secondary. Titans will be a tough one. But then you have your playoffs. You're facing the Saints, who I think you're going to be fighting for a top 5 pick. The Eagles, again, easy secondary, but will be a good game. And then the Falcons, who also I'm not impressed by their secondary. So I do like the playoff schedule. I do like his schedule for the most part down the stretch. And if you drafted Terry McLaurin late, like I did in a league, he was one of my favorite, late round picks that you were getting a wide receiver 1 around 7 or 8. I think he's probably one of the better steals of the draft for this year. So now we're going to go on to trade bait. 1 player to trade away, 1 player to trade for. Players that me and Nick have given you so far. 2 weeks ago, I gave you Tony Pollard, and I told you to trade away. Can't remember. Last week, I told you to trade for Mike Evans, and I told you to trade away DJ Moore. I don't remember all of Nick's picks, but he could recap that.
I got notes. So last week, I said trade for Jalen Waddle, who got minus 24 receiving yards on the last drive of the game. Absolutely ridiculous. Did you see that clip, Nick? Absolutely ridiculous.
I did.
I did say I did not want to play him that week, but he did get the touchdown, which kind of saved it. And I said trade away Ramondre. The week prior to, sorry, we got to do a little bit of scrolling. We said trade for Devon Achane and trade away Derrick Henry. And I pretty much said swap the two if I were you.
All right. And I did take Nick's advice last week. I have a league where my running backs are Saquon, Kenneth Walker, Tank Bigsby, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Then I had Jonathan Brooks coming off the IR. So I traded Brooks for Waddle to get a receiver in my lineup. So I actually did take Nick's advice. That league also have Terry McLaurin. So yeah. And I have the Laporta potty. So that's what's really killing me. All right, Nick, who's your trade for candidate for this week?
So this is a guy I've kind of dunked on for a lot of his short career. Because I don't like him. He also plays for the Denver Broncos, so obviously I like to roast him, but it's Javonte Williams. And like I mentioned with a lot of other guys, on my 5 takeaways, it's guys that were a lot more consistent and a lot better fantasy plays than I thought, and Javonte definitely falls into that category. So right now, he is one of the only running backs in football that has had over 50% snap share in every single game this year. I know what you're thinking. Superstar running back should easily get this. It's not very common, and Javonte's averaging about 60 to 65% per game. Right now, he is a very good plug-and-play guy, and he's worth pretty much absolutely nothing. He has a very safe floor. He's averaging over 4 targets per game. There's only 3 running backs in the league that are doing that at this point of the season. And he only has 2 touchdowns this year, which is kind of an outlier. Last year, he did not get into the end zone much, but the offense is much better this year than it was last year. They are rolling. Bo looks a lot better than I thought he would. I don't think he looks great, but he definitely looks better. And he's got a bunch of easier games coming up. Atlanta, Vegas, Cincinnati, a bunch of weak defenses. And then they play a lot of turnover-worthy teams, and turnovers are very good for this very good defense and put him in a position to score. They get 2 matchups against Kansas City. They play Vegas. They play Cleveland, Indy, Cincy. So all these teams that turn the ball over a lot, they put him in a position to score. He's a very good plug-and-play guy, and he's someone you don't really need to trade much for. I mean, if you think about a weaker receiver, like Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson is the equivalent of Javonte Williams at the running back position, but Javonte offers so much more consistency than a wide receiver like that. So I think he's someone that's sneaky good to trade for. I don't think he's an every week start, but I do think he's a good plug and play guy as running backs get dinged up later in the year.
So I'm going to go with one of Nick's guys, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to trade for him. I'm going to go with Jordan Love. So Jordan Love got hurt last week, week 8, only scored 6.7 fantasy points. Then coming off the injury, he definitely came back a little too soon, 11.9. Those are his 2 worst games of the season. Every other game of the season he's played that he was healthy, so 5 games, his lowest score is 17 points. In those 5 games, he has over 18 points in 3 of them and over 25 points in 2 of them. His average is 18.5. The average is a tiny bit lower, again, because of the 6.7 and the 11.9. This is the time to trade for him. The Jordan Love owner is probably frustrated. He just had 2 back-to-back games and the bye, and probably has picked up a backup quarterback and might like that backup quarterback. So if you need a quarterback, now is the time to attack the Jordan Love owner. On top of that, his playoffs are pretty favorable. The Seahawks, terrible on top of terrible. The Saints, fighting for a draft pick. And then the Vikings, I believe he had 31.2 against the Vikings on week 5. I can't remember if that was the Vikings game, but I think that was the Vikings game, which is his highest game of the season. So divisional matchup will be a big one down the stretch. So all signs point to me that if you have Jordan Love, this is a really good opportunity to go attack him and to not trade him away unless you really need to.
Love it.
All right, your trade away candidate.
I'm going with Nji Harris, a guy that always winds up on an all boom or all bust team. But when's the time to sell? You sell when the iron's hot, and he is on the best 3-game streak of his career, and he just had his bye pass him. So 3 games before the bye, 2 of them with Russell Wilson. He had 3 straight games over 100 yards. Every single game this year, he scored over 8.5, and 5 of the last 6 are over 10. So he has been pretty consistent, and his bad games aren't totally bad. It's not great, but it's not totally bad. And he has these 3 straight games, 2 of them with Russell Wilson, all over 100 yards, over 16 points in each of them. He gets one of the safest workloads. Every single game he has gotten over 13 touches. He's averaging over 16 carries per game. And the one thing that's kind of the outlier for him is he's not check down Charlie. And Russell Wilson, the one thing he always did well was checked down to that running back position. It's what he did in Denver, which made Javonte and Jaleel McLaughlin and those other random running backs that they rotated in there, Samaje Perine, desirable in some spots. He's not getting that passing workload from Russ. I also don't think the Steelers' offensive line is going to keep beating up on teams. They've played a couple bad defensive fronts the last few weeks and bad teams against the run. But on the rest of the season, Nji Harris has the toughest strength of schedule at the running back position. Every single team he plays ranks inside the top 16, and 6 of the remaining games rank inside the top 10. So he has the toughest schedule. He is at the peak of his career right now in terms of fantasy points and consistency. He just came off the bye, so the person that wants him didn't want him for the bye. They want him now that they don't have to worry about it. It is the perfect opportunity to trade away Nji.
I'm going to say that you should trade away Zay Flowers because he's at the peak of his fantasy football productivity. And Zay's been very, very productive this year. He's sitting right now at wide receiver 9. His last 2 games, both 18 plus. But there are some negatives here. There's a crowded offense. They just brought in Deontay Johnson. They have 2 tight ends that they like in Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. And on top of that, they are a run first team with Derrick Henry, who already has 1,000 yards and like 6 touchdowns through 9 weeks. And they still have Lamar Jackson, who's going to account for a lot of rushing upside as well. The other issue that I have here, in games that I put Zay Flowers on the all-bust team that he's actually busted in against teams like the Chiefs and some other tough cornerback matchups, he hasn't played well. And here he has some tough matchups coming up. His next 3 are Pittsburgh, the Chargers, and then Philly. And then his playoffs are the Giants. I know that's an easier one, but then Pittsburgh again, and then Houston. The Houston game will be a big one, week 17. That'll be a playoff implications game, but Houston's a pretty stingy defense. So I don't like the schedule. I don't like the fact that the offense has gotten so crowded. I do love the connection with Lamar, but I think Zay is so valuable at the moment. I think you could trade for a stud running back if you need one right now. I think you could trade for a stud running back or a stud receiver. And I think Zay has so much value that this is the time to unload that value before the value dips. All right, guys. So that is our show. That was season 4, episode 37. Gave you guys a ton of information there. If you have any other questions, reach out to us on social media. Twitter is Primetime FF Pod. Instagram, Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. If you're a first-time viewer and you enjoyed this show, watch it on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Like the video. We'd really appreciate that. If you're listening on an audio streaming platform like iTunes or Spotify, please give us a 5-star and a review. We'd really appreciate that as well. With that said, the next time you'll hear from us will be Friday for our all boom and all buzz teams and some deep sleepers to get you ready for week 10. Thank you guys for listening and supporting, and we'll talk to you guys on Friday.